Okay, so here you see the way that things are moved around on planet Earth in 2020. This is one of the Maersk line, which I think one of the big shipping lines. As far as I can tell, given how little German I understand, this is on the Elbe River, I think. This is the way things move. This is how everything gets to Hawaii and leaves Hawaii. It's on containers. You guys see these every day going around. This is what the trucks are pulling around all over the place. This was actually an invention of the late late 1960s. I don't know exactly when. You'd have to go Google it. But what you did prior to this, let me switch here. Prior to this, here's a little inter-island steamer. So if you're going to take, if Bridget was going to move from, I don't know, Oahu to Maui or Maui to Oahu or something like that, or she's going to, she lives on Maui, she's going to come to Oahu to go to Chaminade. She'd pack her stuff into some boxes, and the boxes would be put on this, and this little boat would chugga, 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 whatever noise it wants to make to Honolulu. So what you did, you can still see, so you go like to Costco or Lowe's or Home Depot or something like that. You have the wooden pallets, and then on top of that you have stuff stacked. That's how you did stuff, and that's literally you just have stacks of that stuff in boxes or in pallets, and these are the booms. You literally would stick it in the holds in the boat. And then there were guys that were called longshoremen who would literally just sit there with cranes. That's what these are. These are 2 cranes, and just lift all the stuff out of the boat and then kerplock it one piece after another. So if you've been in a visual, I'd be like looking in the back of a UPS van, except 20 times larger. But everything had to be taken in and out the same way. It's literally physical. Put it on a crane, lift it out, put it somewhere else on the dock, and someone takes it from the dock, puts it somewhere else, and then just got this long process of moving stuff all over the place. Very, very labor intensive, very time intensive, and oftentimes a lot of damage too. And this is the way stuff has been moved for the last, since people had boats 10, 20,000 years ago. It's always been moved the same way. And that's how you did stuff. So it was slow, but it had the advantage that this little bugger here, if it was going to go to Hilo, they would just tie up in Honolulu, and the guys that were there would just load everything that was going to go to Hilo in this. If it's going to go to Kona, they load everything to Kona. So every boat went to its own direction with all the stuff in there. So it was very slow. The boat didn't have to be particularly fast because it was so slow getting the stuff on the boat. It was so slow getting stuff off the boat. There was no point in rushing to getting to some points anyways. So this is the old way of doing stuff. And that's the way it suddenly changes. We'll just say arbitrarily the 1960s. I don't remember exactly when. And the way that it changed is this guy, it's actually an invention, for those of you that think that, you need to be just some sort of high-tech guy. What the guy basically decided to do is he came up with a steel box, rectangular box, and where he actually made his money. I actually met this guy. We were finishing work one day over at the Kona Hotel or something like that down in Kailua, Kona town. We actually bumped into a guy who was drinking on beer. And it turns out he's the guy that invented this stuff. I don't know how much money it was worth. It had to be like hundreds of millions of dollars. But what he actually invented was a set of links, or latches if you want to latch this box to the box below the latch. So all these boxes are actually linked together. They've got such latches that hook together. And they're all exactly the same size. And so what that meant, and you guys grew up with this, so it's to you, it's nothing. It's the way the world is. But this was so innovative at the time, because basically what you could do is if you have a little factory. So if I don't know, if Aloha makes stuff, I don't know what the hell Aloha makes. So she's making masks. She's making COVID masks. So she goes and puts them in boxes, and then she'd have one of these containers parked outside. She goes and shovels them all. And when she's filled up, when she's filled up the container, she has one of the trucking company come by to pick up the container, take it out, and boom, they put it on something like this. Off it goes. Prior to this, she would have had to put it in boxes, and someone would have picked up each of the boxes and put each of the boxes in the back of a truck and would have gone, think of that little old boat. So what this meant is all of a sudden things became very efficient. You could take all these boxes, and God knows where each of these containers is from, but you can literally fill them with your stuff, and then they can get sent anywhere in the world. They're sealed in this. They're not going to go anywhere in a hurry. The boat can now go a lot faster, and when it gets to where it's going to be, this is somewhere in Europe, then this big crane picks up one of these suckers and goes, plops it down here, gets stuck in the back of a truck, and off it goes to wherever you want it to go to. This was the huge innovation of the late 20th century, probably more revolutionary than anything else, maybe except the jet airplane. And that was the idea of containers. And so container transportation is an enormously important innovation of the last half of the 20th century. And initially, everyone just thought, oh, this is better than a box. It also put a bunch of people out of business who had the old style boats that only did boxes, because all of a sudden they couldn't handle these things. There were several downsides that didn't occur to anyone at the time, and you actually sort of see it here. We'll assume that this boat's coming in from China. That's probably a good guess. So it's got all these containers here. And we'll say all this back row of containers, all 300 whatever containers here, are all iPhones made by the Foxconn factory in China. So this is like, 85 gazillion. I have no idea how many iPhones you can fit in a 40-foot container, but I'm willing to bet it's a ton of iPhones. So enough iPhones here to basically give a free one to like half the population in Europe, probably. So you got this whole huge pile of iPhones back here that Apple's got, and they're shipping them to Europe. Now, the problem is Europe's a very complicated place. There's a ton of different places in Europe. And we'll say that each city in Europe only needs half a container. So what's the problem you've got once you've now unloaded all these suckers? All these iPhones are sitting over here in a pile over here in these containers. What have you got to do next? Now remember, sort of a trick question, because remember, each container actually has stuff for 2 cities. What are your 2 options? What would be the easiest thing to do if you're Apple? I will say this container here is going to go to Copenhagen and Denmark, and I have no idea, Berlin and Germany. What would be the easiest thing to do? Because remember, you just literally put this on the back of a truck and drive it all over creation. You guys are thinking way too hard. This is a Tuesday afternoon question.
Wait, didn't you just say it though? Like they would
Sure.
put it on the truck and then they would drive it. What was your question?
Okay, so this container here, we now arrived in, we're somewhere, I don't know where, somewhere in Europe. So this container has the iPhones for Copenhagen and Denmark and for Berlin and Germany. I'm just guesstimating those are about maybe 400 miles apart. But the container has half of this is for one city, half of these for another city. So if I'm Apple, what's the fastest and most efficient way to get all these phones to their stores in those 2 cities? There's sort of 2 ways you can do it. What would probably be the fastest way?
Probably take the phones out for each specific city and then like distribute them separately.
Okay, right. So that's one way to do it. Now, the lazy way to do it would just be to hook a truck, drive it to Copenhagen first, dump all the phones off, then drive the truck to Berlin and dump all the phones off. Either way, you get the same result, right? Now, the way that you said it has an advantage. If I drive, if we'll say fuel, I'm just guesstimating, I'm not sure what it is right now, but gasoline in Europe is tremendously expensive. So we'll say that it's roughly $10 a gallon to drive a truck, and a truck only goes maybe 10 miles per gallon. So it's going to cost you maybe a couple of, maybe $500 to drive the truck from Copenhagen to Berlin. So you're going to have to drive the truck to Copenhagen, dump them off, drive them to Berlin if you use that model. So you've now got a pretty large added expense. Plus the guys in Berlin are going to be all pissed off because they won't get their phones till after Copenhagen has. If you do it Peyton's way and you split them all up here, then you basically can find a truck that's going to Copenhagen, throw all the iPhones with anything else that's going to Copenhagen, and throw all the stuff that's going to Berlin to all the stuff in Berlin. This is what UPS and US Mail and everyone else does. Okay? They do it Peyton's way. They find a separate place and they sort of like crap out, figure out where it's going to go in terms of location, and then boom, off it goes. Okay. Now, that's called, so sort of hold this in your mind. Think of how much junk is on this boat for a second. That's what we call break of bulk. So if you think of the container, I'm not sure where the technical term comes from, but you also call it break of container. So you've got all the containers, but all the containers are pretty much defined by a factory or place that makes them. So if Aloha's got her face masks, they're probably going everywhere in the world, but she's going to throw all their face masks into her container, which means at some point, some of those face masks are going to be going to places that might be thousands of miles away where they're supposed to go. We'll say she's sending some of them to Japan, she's sending some of them to LA, she's sending some of them to New York and some to London. So if that container is only going one place, that might be fine if you live in LA because that's where it ends up. But if you live in Japan, now you've got to go 7,000 miles from LA to get the mass there. So break-a-bulk is doing what Peyton said. What you do is you take the container to some central location, sort it all out, figure out where it's going to go, and then you ship it to that particular place. I can never remember where UPS's headquarters are. I'm going to say it's Atlanta, Georgia, but I could be wrong. But if you actually Google that and then you look at the airport, you'll see this huge area that's set aside with nothing but this massive area of things where they actually do that. They have these enormous warehouses where they sort everything out and figure out where it's going to go. That's what Amazon warehouses do too. They ship everything to there almost like a Costco would, but then they divvy it up in terms of whatever their zone is, in terms of where it's actually going to go when it gets put in the back of a truck or something. That's only an innovation you actually needed once you come up with containers. Back in the old days when you had boxes, you could literally sort it out from the minute it went on the boat. You could sort out from the minute it went off the boat. And so in that regard, life was a lot simpler. All I had to do was look at the label on the box. The minute it's a container, you don't know because the container has a bunch of, the container is defined by what it is. It's not really defined very much by where it's going. So it added a new complexity, which initially I don't think they really thought about. And now everything's in containers. And you move cars by containers, you move boats by containers. It's just sort of surreal. So those containers, that massive blue ship with all those containers on, is the way the world works in the 21st century. By the 1980s, 1990s, as fuel costs started to drive and people became more time sensitive, people became a lot more demanding that they wanted stuff right away. Think of Amazon with theoretically prime delivery if you're on the mainland, or Target for that matter. Then all of a sudden, the idea of sorting stuff out became really, really critical. And that segues us to this. Let me zoom out here for a sec. Let's get back to Singapore, which is, I think, where we ended up last time. Sorry, Google Earth is sleepy this morning, or this afternoon. Well, maybe. So a huge part of the world's production, as we've seen earlier already this semester, is actually here in China. And a lot of that's going to go to Europe. Or it's going to go to the East Coast of the United States, which in some ways is sort of the same thing. That means it's going to be piled on those huge blue container boats, whether it be, I don't know, some companies' LED TV sets, whether it be another company's phones, whether it be another company's shoes, clothing, whatever it is. It's all going to be, each company's going to pile all their junk into their set of containers, and it'll get stuck in that big blue boat. Now they're going to split the boats up into two groups. There's going to be the boats going to the west coast of the United States, or I should say the west coast of the Americas, which go straight from China out. And there's going to be the other boats which are going, whether it be India, the Africas, or any place like that, are going to go west. So they go through the South China Sea and they come through here. And the way that you get through here is you go right through this very narrow spot here. And you sail off this way and you're in the Indian Ocean. From there you go wherever it is you got to go, Europe, South America, wherever. And you go through here. Now the British, by the early 1800s, when everything was still with little boats with sails, realized that this made this spot an incredibly important point. Initially, it's just because it's so dangerous. You think if you're in one of those big blue boats, you're trying to wiggle your way through this spot. If you one second of not paying attention, it's going to be a big whang, and the boat's going to be up on the ground. That's going to be the end of the whole thing. So one was just really dangerous, and here's the strait that you go through right here. So the British decided, since they wanted to make sure that they were in charge of everything, is they made this into a colony, and they called it Singapore. And they put up big forts here, and they basically, like a toll road, they basically controlled anyone that wanted to go through here had to pay them some money. So the British basically controlled everything going from Asia to Europe and everything going from Europe to Asia. And you have to remember, until the mid 20th century, Europe was the big consumer and buyer of stuff, not North America. It was Europe. So pretty much probably 80% of what the world bought and sold went through this place. Now, initially what that meant is Singapore very quickly developed into a huge harbor to both repair ships, for ships to stop over, whatever it might be. And that's pretty much what it did. Even with World War II, the Japanese took it over, the British got it back. In the 1950s, early 1960s, Singapore became, when this whole area got independence, Singapore initially became part of the country of Malaysia, which includes everything here. Okay. Now, Singapore is ethnically, the majority population is Chinese. That's something that's too complicated for pretty much for this class, pretty much. But the Malaysian population is largely Malay, and Chinese are a minority. Under the British, it didn't really make any difference because the British were writing the rules for everyone. So they pretty much said, you know, you guys, whatever you guys want to do, we don't care, but you're going to do what we tell you to do. When this region got independence, the folks that are the majority population, the Malays, said that they should be in charge. And they didn't particularly like the Chinese. The Chinese and this rest of Malaysia decided things weren't looking good, and a lot of them moved and migrated down to Singapore, which already had a large Chinese population. A couple of years, I don't know, you can check Google, a couple years after the whole thing started, Singapore, which was part of Malaysia, was like a state, like say California or Nevada or whatever, decided that it wasn't working, and Singapore left Malaysia and became an independent country. Singapore right now is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I just checked in Google. It's got something like 6 or 7 million people. And it's nothing but this little tiny clump of islands right here. Here's the border of Singapore. It goes right like this and right down here. And that's it. That's the whole thing. This is all Malaysia. This is all Malaysia. The only part that's Singapore is this part here. Now, the problem that they had was sort of twofold. If you're an independent country, you're now sovereign, which means you make your own decisions. But it also means you can't hit up anyone for cash. It means you pretty much better have your act together because you have to pay your own bills. And initially what that meant is, okay, they had the big harbor facilities. But Singapore was an incredibly impressive place when you look at it. It's a very complex place. If you ever met anyone from Singapore, it's interesting because they're all quadrilingual. If you're in Singapore, you speak Malay, Chinese, English, and I forget what the fourth language is. And they mix it all together in a sentence. If you ever hear people from Singapore talking, you can never understand what the hell they're saying. I mean, because I understand English and Chinese, and I can get like 5 words out of 12. So folks from Singapore are very impressive. Almost everyone in Singapore not only speaks the local language, which is a mix, it's a pidgin, but they also speak at least 3 of the 4 local languages. So they're all trilingual. So the next time you think of a hard time learning a foreign language, think of being from Singapore. Now, the interesting thing that they got into is they realized very quickly that they didn't have any friends out here. All these folks around here don't like them anymore because they said goodbye. And what they realized very early is they saw when those containers started up, and the country of Singapore decided that its future, given it's so little in terms of space, it's essentially 1/3 or 1/2 the size of the island of Oahu, and it's a separate country. So they realized very early on that they were going to have to make some radical changes if they wanted to survive in the 20th century. And they looked at containers, and there's some sort of light bulb went off, and they went, because what they realized is what Peyton was talking about. What they thought is, okay, there's going to be 2 things. One is people are going to want to put containers somewhere to sort them out. Secondly, if you provide a central location for people to sort out this stuff, so the boats have left China, they're full of all sorts of junk on the boats. If you have some sort of central spot where you can then stop the boat, sort out everything so you can put it on one boat that goes to Italy, one boat that goes to Germany, one boat that goes to England, one boat that goes to New York, then you're just going to save yourself a ton of money and a ton of time if you find a central spot that's really organized and can do this in a hurry. This is what Singapore invented. Singapore invented what's called break of bulk. This is the Singapore container facilities. Each of these boats here is the size of that one we saw in that picture. It's the size of one of those blue monsters. If you want to put it in context, you're familiar with Sand Island, where we have our containers here. Sand Island, the entire Sand Island would be about 3 of these squares. Singapore is the 2nd largest container yard in the world. And what it specializes in is not just having containers, but sorting out containers. So this big container ship stops here, it unloads everything it's got. It then says, okay, we're going to Italy. And what the yard does is the yard actually sorts out every container that's all around the spot that's going to go to Italy, and they pile it on this boat. This boat over here says, oh, I'm going to Germany. So they do the same thing for it. This boat's going to Long Beach, California. They put everything on that. So Singapore made itself the absolute center for sorting out containers. and they have captured the world's market in this. Singapore is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, almost entirely off of this one piece of real estate. They've cornered the market in that because they're in a, and most important is because of their geography. Everyone has to go through here anyways, so why not park here, sort the stuff out, take what you have to go. So one blue boat's going to go to Italy, one blue boat's going to go to Germany, and you've sorted it all out here. So now it's much more efficient when you get to wherever it is you're going to go. That's break of bulk. Singapore is the only place in the world that does this. Rotterdam in Holland does a smaller version of it for Europe. Long Beach does it for the west coast of the United States, and New York does it for the east coast of the United States. I think Galveston, Texas does it for the other part of the United States. So there are places that do a little bit of this, but Singapore is the one that captures the market because of its very central location. Everyone has to pass through here anyways, so you might take advantage, might as well take advantage of it. Now, back by the 1980s, maybe we could. By the 1980s, Singapore had realized this was incredibly successful. I mean, their future was basically made. As long as there's containers, Singapore's making money. I don't even think COVID's made any difference, to be honest, because they don't care. Anything being shipped still has to go through Singapore. In the 1980s, they were trying to figure out, because the one part of the market they didn't tap if you're Singapore, is you don't tap the Pacific part. All the stuff that's sailing from Asia, whether it be China, Korea, Japan, now Vietnam, that all goes across the Pacific and ends up scattered all sorts of places. Some of it has to go to Seattle, some goes to Vancouver, British Columbia. So a lot of it goes to Long Beach. It goes to Chile and Peru. It goes all up and down the western side of the Americas. And Singapore wasn't getting a penny of that because all they were doing is they were getting all the traffic going the other way. So it's like if you turned left, they got that. If you turned right, they didn't get a penny of that. And they decided they wanted a penny of that because by the 1980s, they'd figured out how to do sorting out break and bulk. And they were looking for the other place on the planet that would complement what they did. And they actually approached the state of Hawaii and asked them, can you get control of Pearl Harbor from the military? By the 1980s, the military was only using this section here and this section over here. There was housing over here, but it's important to remember that until 1942, the military didn't control any of Pearl Harbor with the exception of this piece here. In 1942, with World War II having started, the military condemned everyone else's property. This all used to be privately owned. The second largest town in Hawaii was actually here, which was called Rivertown, real innovative name. It's actually, if you think of where Aloha Stadium is, that whole area around Aloha Stadium, Pearl Ridge and stuff was actually called Rivertown, and about 8,000 people lived there. It was the second largest community after Honolulu. And so all this, basically all these people were thrown out. All this land was taken over by the military for the war. And the deal they gave everyone was when World War II was ended, they would give all this property back to their private owners. So it was a temporary borrowing. We're going to borrow this property and give it to when the war's finished. Well, World War II ended, but then the Korean War started, the Cold War started, eventually Vietnam War started, and the military got really comfortable keeping all this area. So they decided they didn't want to give any of it up. So the military still controls Pearl Harbor. The US Navy, this is the only major harbor in the entire world that's owned by a military, is Pearl Harbor. There's no other harbor, whether it be in Russia, China, there's no other harbor in the world where an entire harbor is owned by a military. If Kayla or someone else wants to go into Pearl Harbor, you get into here. The guys in large boats with machine guns come up and basically tell you to stop. If you don't, they shoot you on the spot. This entire harbor is entirely controlled by the military. If you're local and you're dumb enough to go swimming off of here, they'll stop you. If you don't stop, they'll shoot you on the spot. That's because we've got nuclear subs, there's nuclear weapons, all sorts of stuff here, but it's only in this part of Pearl Harbor. Now, every other harbor in the United States has nuclear subs and nuclear stuff. San Diego Harbor, for example, has the rest of the nuclear fleet. Long Beach has nuclear subs. So everywhere else in the United States where you have large harbors, the Navy mixes their use with civilians. Here in Hawaii, they don't. And what Singapore was asking the state of Hawaii and the federal government was, is there any reason that the US Navy is keeping 3/4 of the harbor, but they're not using any of it? It's just sitting there, it's unused. And the answer was no, except the Navy no like give it up. And as of today, the Navy won't give it up. Having said that, Singapore offered to pay the entire expense to turn this part of the harbor into a copy of Singapore. They were willing to actually pay all the money to turn this into giant container yards, and everything that Singapore's got to turn Hawaii into basically the other Singapore. It would remain part of the United States, it'd still be a state, but Singapore would get, I think, 5 or 10% of whatever the money was made out of this. So they'd put all the money to make it. It wouldn't cost the taxpayer a penny. And then the result is you'd have roughly an estimated 20,000 jobs. And the pay scale would be completely off the charts because basically these folks in Singapore get paid a lot of money to work on those yards. Because this would make our location unique because again, you don't really notice it till you look at airplane routes. If you fly from Seattle to Hawaii, it's around 2,500 miles. If you fly from San Francisco, it's 24. LA, it's 23.5. From the West Coast of Mexico, it's 25. From Vancouver, BC, it's 26.5. From Alaska, it's 27. There's only a couple of 100-mile difference between the entire West Coast of North America and landing in Honolulu Harbor, or I should say landing in Honolulu Airport. So in that situation, that's what Singapore was looking at. Hawaii is one of the other unique locations on the planet by virtue of its physical position to actually operate as a break-of-bulk harbor point. You can't do it in Sand Island because Sand Island is so frickin' small. And if you look at it from our standpoint, it looks pretty large, but think of how small that looks. In fact, I take that back. That's about one of those rectangles in Singapore. And I believe Singapore has roughly 80 rectangles like that. And this is everything that the state of Hawaii gets for a couple of weeks comes into this spot. And there's just no way to get boats in and out. It's just, if you've ever been in Sand Island, I used to run my boat back and forth there. I know some of the harbor pilots. Honolulu Harbor is considered one of the most dangerous harbors in the Pacific. It's really shallow. It's incredibly narrow. And this is like trying to park a really large pickup in Costco's parking lot. There's no room. You have to back up. You watch the large boats have to back up. The big mats and container ships have to back up for 15 minutes, in and out, trying to get so they can get their nose pointed out here to get the hell out. If they come in, it's the same nightmare in reverse. It's actually, it's a horror. The captains hate it. It's their worst nightmare is coming into Honolulu Harbor. And there's no space when they get here. So you can never expand. In fact, they just tore out all this stuff that you see here has now been torn out. And that's now new containers. They put in a new container yard here, which is only going to add a little bit of space. In fact, you can see it right here. So what you've got is Sand Island can't be made any larger, which means you can't make any more money off of it. You can basically ship stuff that's going to go to Hawaii, but you can't use it for breakable because you don't have any space. If you compare that with this, you realize it's just an entire scale different. The military still keep anything it's using, but Singapore would pay all the cost to basically turn the rest of this into a massive, break of bulk point, which would generate probably almost as much revenue as tourism does in Hawaii. A lot less polluting, a lot less social impacts, almost entirely local jobs. I mean, this list goes on and on and on and on. The only thing stopping it is that the U.S. Navy won't do it. And the U.S. government won't make the Navy cough up the rest of the harbor. And the state, of course, doesn't have any power because the Navy's a federal service. The state's a level below. So break of bulk is a huge issue here in Hawaii. It got brought up back in the 1980s when Singapore made the offer. Singapore every 10 years or so reiterates the offer. The last time I think they did was in 2015. They basically told the state of Hawaii, by the way, the offer's still up. Despite the increased cost, we will still pay the entire cost of renovating this area as a break and bulk point, as long as you get, I think it's like 7% of something of the total revenues that come across it. All the rest belongs to whoever's actually running the place in Hawaii. If you think of just the IT cost alone, because all containers are basically tracked by code, everything in the containers is tracked by computer codes. This is all incredibly high tech. In fact, containers in Singapore aren't touched by people. Even the loading, unloading things are all automated. Here it's still done by folks. If you ever go in and talk to the guys in the container yard, they literally drive a truck up and pick those containers off the boat and have to put them down by hand, which is really retro in the way that Singapore does it. So this could be a big part of Hawaii's future, and it isn't. The current EGA administration has not seen fit to discuss this for whatever set of reasons. So for whatever it's worth. So break of bulk, most parts of the planet, it would just be something that you'd have on a geography test. Like what does this term mean type thing. But for you guys, this literally would be why you wouldn't have to leave Hawaii and you could make a lot of money and stay here. This is potentially part of our future because there's no place else in the world that has a harbor of this size at this location on planet Earth. Okay, so it's one of the few cases that actually our geography works in our favor. In most cases, as you're well aware, our geography works against us because we're so far away from any place. It means that anything you buy from the mainland costs more to get shipped out here. Well, if this break of bulk place were in point, then it wouldn't be that case. It'd be just the opposite. Your shipping costs would probably be cheaper than if you're on the mainland. So, anyways, so break of bulk. Break of bulk is hugely important in Hawaii because of the potential it offers that's not being taken advantage of for a set of political reasons, which are what they are, I guess, for lack of a better term. Okay, and all this sort of segues into the next part, which is this whole issue of production. There's sort of two phases to production. The first phase is something that people still get into. In fact, one of the interesting things about sort of, I'd say more Amazon than COVID, is that if you think about it, if you guys were around, well, you guys were around before Amazon, but back in the day before Amazon was a big thing, pretty much whatever you saw in stores was something that was sold in bulk. So there was a lot of it made. If you went to Target or Walmart or any place else, there was some sort of a brand that was, someone made 10 or 20 or 100,000 of them. And you don't really think about this until you think of someplace like, oh yeah, my favorite place to hate would be Hollister's, which used to be, I'm sure it's probably still there. It's a store in Ala. People used to have Hollister's logo wear. As when I was a teenager, I had to help my dad's company install air conditioning in places like Hollister, which is actually a small, really ratty little town in the central part of Southern California where it gets to about 112 in the summer. So I remember Hollister is this real nasty place that smelled really bad. We used to have to sit on the top of a Safeway store or something like that and repair their air conditioning. It was 110 degrees out there. So when people came up with Hollister logo wear, I couldn't see just exactly what the point is. If it said, I don't live in Hollister, I don't want to go to Hollister, I would understand it, but why you'd think Hollister would be something to advertise. I still can't figure what that's about. But the thing is there's Hollister stores all over the place, which means on one hand, you might have a Hollister t-shirt, which you think sort of gives you a sense of identity with who you want to be, till you realize that Hollister, the company, probably made 100,000 of those t-shirts. So there's 100,000 people that bought it so they could be unique. When you think about it, 100,000, the word unique isn't really a good fit necessarily. Prior to that, if who haven't I picked on yet? Oh, okay. If Kaylin is making t-shirts 60 or 80 years ago, prior to factories, how does she make a t-shirt? I'll give you, it has to do with a sewing machine. This is another Tuesday afternoon question. So if your brain starts to hurt, you're thinking too hard.
You like get cotton or like the raw materials and then you have to like thread it. You gotta thread it and then you gotta sew it.
Yeah. Yeah. So if someone wants 5 t-shirts, she sits there with a cotton, she cuts out and she makes 5 t-shirts. I mean, you guys still do this. I don't even know if people do that anymore. I mean, we use sewing machines on boats to fix sails, but I don't know if people actually make clothes anymore. But yeah, I mean, that's how you did it. So if there was a store, what happens if Target wants to start carrying her t-shirts? What's the problem she's going to have? And I have no idea. We'll say there's 100 Target stores and they want to start carrying her t-shirts for girls. So they think they can sell 80 t-shirts a week per store. So 100 times 80 is a lot of t-shirts. So
She's
what's
not
she
gonna
going to have to
keep up
do?
with that. She has to keep up with the demand, right?
Which means she's going to be working 26 hours a day sewing t-shirts, right? Because that's just her and the one sewing machine and a lot of cotton and a lot of scissors and a lot of tired fingers. I'm pretty sure she's going to start stitching her fingers with a sewing machine or something like that. So yeah, I mean, she's going to have to expand. So this old way of doing things where people made stuff, not so much necessarily by hand, but they made it sort of on demand, piece by piece, which if you think about it, be what you do in a restaurant, is what we call a cottage industry. Okay. I have no idea where the term originally comes from. You'd have to ask on the economists, maybe they know. But it basically means that you make stuff as it's, someone says, I need this, and you go, okay, and you make it. That's the old way of doing stuff. Now, when large scale companies start up in the late 19th, early 20th century, they start wanting to do stuff in bulk. They want to start selling a lot of something. They're less interested in a lot of different variety, and they want to sell a lot of a t-shirt. They're not interested in 20 different t-shirts. They want a t-shirt. So what you get is you get the move from this to what's oftentimes called the Industrial Revolution, which starts probably about the 1830s. And if you want to think, it's not so much the Industrial Revolution that we're interested in, it's mass production. So going back, I forgot who I picked on, but going back to my original case, if she's making t-shirts, what's her option? If she's got to make more t-shirts than she can possibly make by herself, what's her options?
Expand.
Okay, expand. How she's sort of got two ways she can expand. Well, what might they be? Think of this as on-the-job training for you guys when you guys become successful. It was Caitlin that I picked on, that's right. So if Caitlin's really successful, and since she's got all these orders outstanding, so she's now got to make 800 t-shirts a week. And we'll say that she can only make about 40 before eyes start falling out. So how's she going to make the other 700 and, I don't know, 60 or something like that?
She's gonna hire people.
Hire people.
Okay, one way is to hire people. So now she's got 20 people all sitting around, all sewing out the shirts and all, cutting all the pieces and all making one shirt at a time. What's the other way she can do it? What's the mass production way to do it?
You buy a machine that can sew it for her or something like that.
Okay, yeah. In fact, what you do is you see this with the guys that make a lot of the newer types of boards, since I do a lot of fiberglass work, is they actually use a laser cutter and they cut out 300 sheets of the same thing. So you don't cut out a t-shirt out of cotton. You lay the big sheets of cotton down, the machine cuts 300 t-shirt sizes at the same time. And then like Kayla pointed out, then you got a machine that then sews each of them individually. So that sucker can probably make 500 t-shirts an hour. They're not unique in the way that it was when she made them herself. But now she has no trouble coming up with, an order doing 800. It's like, okay, that just takes a couple hours. Now, what's the problem she's got into if we'll say that she's now bought the machinery, she now cut out the cotton to make the t-shirts. She's now got another machine that sews the t-shirts. We'll say she's even got another machine that prints the logo on the t-shirts or whatever it is. Now what's the problem she's got? It's now a week later, she's made all the orders for Target. And she's going, phew. She decides to stop, she's gonna have a beer and she's gonna think about it. What's the problem she's got in the next couple of weeks? It's the opposite. What's the huge problem you get into when you mechanize and you're successful? What does she need to see next week? She's just piled all the boxes from Target in the back of the container and off they go. So everyone's going around, yeah, we got that order done. Now what a couple hours later, what are they gonna be looking around at each other for?
More orders.
Yeah, more orders. She's got to pay for the equipment. She's got the new big building there and she's got these people working. So once she's invested the money on this, she constantly has to find more people wanting t-shirts, or pretty soon, ironically, she's going to go bankrupt. So she went from an original spot where she couldn't make enough stuff, she was going to die from making t-shirts all the time. But if she expands to a certain extent, she might be okay, but it's sort of iffy. If she expands a lot, now she can make those t-shirts in a hurry, but now she needs a lot of people wanting t-shirts if she's going to be able to pay for all the stuff that she bought. Okay. That's the thing with the Industrial Revolution and mass production. Mass production works, but the problem with mass production is it needs mass consumption. If you're making something en masse, you have to have people constantly wanting that particular item so that you can constantly sell it again and again and again. And you see companies constantly fail in any point of time. Because on one hand, we'll say that she had a really cute t-shirt and people really liked it. But the problem was is after they'd bought one or two, they weren't interested in buying any more. So pretty soon, what's going to happen to her t-shirt sales? They call this market demand. Okay. We'll say that, go ahead.
They'll drop the sales?
Yeah, the sales will drop because she's fulfilled her market demand. Everyone that wanted the shirts got the shirt. And at that point, they've got one. They don't need three unless the dog eats it or something like that. So all of a sudden, her sales are going to drop. And at that point, she's now stuck with all that machinery. She's got all that cotton. She's got all the logos and all the stuff on it. And she's got no one that wants it anymore. That's why you see stuff in Ross's. Okay. What you're looking at when you look at Ross's, and I can't remember what the other one is at all at the discount store. When you're looking at stuff in discount stores, what you're seeing is something where the market demand has ended. But the company that was making the stuff kept on making it because they had to hope that they were going to sell them. And when it doesn't happen, plonk, and it gets sold for $4 or $6 or whatever to Ross's. That's the problem of mass production. Mass production is always, it's a scary situation because it's always sort of a sliding situation. The more you make, the more the market demand you fulfill. The more the market demand you fulfill, there's less people that need it, which means all of a sudden at that point, you're out of business. Now, if you're someone like Apple, what happens when everyone has a smartphone? What do? We'll say that you guys all have I don't know what the number is. I think it's a smartphone 10 or something like that. You guys all have your smartphone 10s. Now, what's the problem I have if I'm Apple? It's the same as her with the t-shirts.
You need to come up with something new.
Yeah, you have to come up with something new because if everyone's got it, unless you, like my sister, she always puts them in her back pocket and sits on them, which means she's now on a phone, which is why she can't afford iPhones. So, unless people break them, you have no demand left. So if you're Apple, what do? In fact, they're supposed to have it, I think, near the end of the year, early next year.
You make another iPhone.
You make a, quote, new and improved iPhone 12 that's got all sorts of stuff the iPhone didn't have, so you guys will immediately be all bummed that you've got an iPhone 10. And especially if you are in high school, you can't possibly be seen with an iPhone 10 because everyone's going to think that you're, live in a tree or something like that because anyone who's real has an iPhone 12. Okay. So Apple survives not on the fact that they don't even have to add anything new. In fact, that I've seen the reviews, the new iPhone 12 really isn't much of anything compared to the iPhone 10. It's not really that much better at all, but it's going to cost you $1,000. And the reason it's going to cost $1,000 is Apple wants to make sure if you're carrying one around, one, it says that you're trendy. Two, it says you got a grand, or someone that does. Okay. So they basically set up their market demand. So at that point, as long as they can convince someone they need the new iPhone, the weird situation, what are you going to have then happen at the same time? If now you guys have got iPhone 12s, what are there a bunch bouncing around the countryside? What do you guys all got in a drawer? What do you have to trade in? They're perfectly functional iPhone 10s. The last month were all you ever needed, and all of a sudden now are embarrassing to be seen walking around with. Okay? This is the way we consume in the United States. This is modern consumption in the 21st century. It's not unique to the United States, but this is the way it happens. And that's how you make mass production work. You get people dissatisfied with what they just purchased. In fact, if you do it right, you get people dissatisfied when they buy something, they're already thinking about the next thing that they can't afford, even though they just bought something brand new. And in that process, you then basically create persistent demand, and that keeps your factories running, that keeps you making money. The only one that loses out on all that, of course, is the consumer, because they're buying a bunch of stuff that really, in many cases, doesn't really make any functional difference. So the Industrial Revolution is important because look at the difference between this model you have, where you basically drive perception of consumption, versus the other one, which is you bought something because someone had made it and it was something that you wanted or something you needed. Two very different ways of looking at the idea of production or making things. And so in the modern system, what you get is mass production. That goes back to that huge container boat, the blue one at the very beginning of class. The only reason that boat exists, the only reason all those thousands of containers in that boat exist, the only reason Singapore exists is because people are never happy with what they have. People always want more. They want more either because they personally makes them feel better, or because their friends have it and they want it, or even better, their friends don't have it and they want to be the first to have it. For whatever set of reasons, there's always this need to consume, which has become one of the ways that we judge each other in the modern world. That's what we call, mass consumerism is based on the idea that you judge others by the way that they look, by what they carry on them. And that's the way that we basically assess whether someone's, successful or not, by virtue of the way that they style themselves. There's all sorts of subsets of this. When I work with the guys from Silicon Valley, there what you do is you wear jeans. And the jeans you wear in Silicon Valley cost, according to a friend of mine who works for Google, if you're in middle management at Google, the jeans that you wear cost about $2,000 a pair. And the reason they cost $2,000 a pair is because what you actually have is you have someone make you a pair of jeans. So they're actually tailored jeans that they then wash to make look like they're used. That's the uniform if you live in San Jose, Palo Alto, California. The shoes that you wear will be sports shoes, but again, they'll be about $4,000 to $8,000 because they're actually handmade. Okay. So what you have is all sorts of different uniforms depending on where you are. But he's worked at Google for now 8 months, and he can tell you within 20 seconds of someone walking in the door how much they're worth by virtue of the jeans and the shoes they've got, which to me all look the same. They look like jeans and shoes, sports shoes, but not to him. If you're in New York, it might be a three-piece suit. But the thing is what you have is the mass production and mass consumption has completely changed in the last 100 years how things are made, why they're made, and why they're consumed. If you think about it, this goes back to what we were looking at earlier in terms of discards and garbage. A lot of the garbage you throw away, especially in the United States, is actually functional still. But people don't want it because they've got something new. You see this classically with TVs. The number of older flat screen TVs I see when I'm walking to work and back and forth. I bet the vast majority of those are still functional. But it's just someone got a bigger one, a 4HK or whatever it is, and so they don't need the old one anymore. That's very much a part of our world. So a lot of the overconsumption that we practice is tied to the fact that for companies that make things, they need you to overconsume, otherwise they go out of business. It's a sort of weird gerbil in a wheel type thing. Okay, Fordist and post-Fordist. You'll see this if you ever go into business classes. I used to teach a cross-cultural business class years ago over UH. Fordist and post-Fordist are real interesting concepts. And the best example would probably be the actual car. Let's see if I can pull up a picture of one of these. Don't need the mask thing. Let's see. Let's find out. Oops. Come on, buggers. Okay, can you guys see this car? Okay, here you see a Ford Model T. Nowadays they just look sort of cute. Actually, this is a perfect picture. Ford was the first person to realize, prior to him, cars were pretty much made by hand. Companies would make a few of them, but cars were one, incredibly expensive. Of course, most people didn't know how to drive them. In most cases, there weren't really any roads to drive them on anyways. They're all like mud trails. Ford was the first one to realize if you mass produced a car and you mass produced it to a low enough cost, you could increase the number of people that could buy the car to the point where now you basically could do this whole mass production thing. You just keep on scaling up and growing and growing and growing until basically everyone on the planet owned a car, which is what he was hoping. So the Model T is an example of that. The Model T was designed to a cost. So what he was constantly trying to do when he was building these things, once it started and they were actually becoming successful, is everything that he did, he tried to make sure he could cut the cost of it lower and lower. Because if he basically cut the cost of building the car down, he'd still charge as much at the end price. So if Bridget or Aloha or someone wants to actually buy one of these cars, and we'll say it was $1,000. So we'll say 6 months after he started building, he's figured out a way to actually cut the cost by 20%. He's still going to charge $1,000. Why is he a real happy camper when he does that? What's the advantage to Henry Ford at the end of the week? The car still sells for the same amount, but the amount it costs to make has now shrunk by this much.
He'll make more profit.
More profit, exactly. Yeah, so he's going to make a lot more money. So every time he can cut the cost in this sucker, it's more money that he makes. And it also means that if someone else comes along and starts to copy him, since there was nothing copyrighted in mass producing cars, if also other companies like Chevrolet or something start mass producing cars, then he can basically get into a price war with them. He can afford to cut the cost of his car because he's already figured out he was already making a bigger profit. He just takes a little more, he takes a little less money, charges a little less, and all of a sudden his car is now cheaper than anyone else's. Now to do that, he had to figure out ways to constantly cut the cost. And he was also having problems once he started making a lot of cars, that originally all that Ford made, as far as I remember, was the body and the motor. Everything else that you see on this car was actually made by some other company who then he would just, they would just ship him boxes of the parts, he'd put them on the car. So I'll say the best example I can remember is actually the guys that made the wheels. These wheels are made out of wood. So the wheels were actually made originally, these are the same type of wheels you would have had on a carriage, on a horse-drawn carriage. And originally he had companies, I don't know where, somewhere in the Midwest. They're already making carriage wheels, and he said, okay, I need 500 sets of these wheels for my cars. And they go like, okay. And all of a sudden he gets back a week later and says, hey, these are selling really well. Now I need 10,000 of these. Now we're back in sort of the same situation as K-Lender and T-shirts. Okay? Because most of these companies were actually sort of cottage industries. So they could make 500 sets of these in maybe a week. But they couldn't make 10,000 because they only had like 5 or 10 guys in the shop, and they were turning these things out of wood, they were da-da-da-da. And basically they just said, no, we can't do it. And all of a sudden he's getting all pissed off because he's got all these cars he's made. Now they're all sitting up in blocks because they got no wheels because the wheel guys can't get their act together. So he's got no wheels, so he can't sell the cars. No one's going to buy a car without wheels. So he got trapped. The guys with the wheels couldn't come up with enough wheels. The guys that made the paint couldn't come up with enough paint. The guys that made like the steering wheels couldn't come up with enough steering wheels. The guys that were making the leather for the seats couldn't come up with enough leather because they never had to make that many of something before. They'd always just made a few. And so Ford saw himself starting this horrible nightmare. He could basically sell these cars as fast as he could make the damn things. The parts that he made, he could make fast enough to sell them. But all the other parts that weren't under his control, he was getting reamed. He was literally had warehouses full of cars waiting for wheels, waiting for seats, waiting for wheels and tires that he couldn't do anything about. So what he got is he just said, well, screw this. I've had enough of this crap. And so he started what's now called Fordist production. He basically went to the guys that made the wheels. They said, okay, can you guys make any more wheels? They said, no. We can only make them this fast. And they said, well, I think you guys are full of crap. So he buys the company that makes the wheels, makes a new company out of it, hires a bunch more people, makes a big factory that makes the wheels. So pretty soon, in say 4 or 6 months down the road, now he's got all his wheels because there's a big factory making wheels, just like the big factory that makes the car bodies. Now, what's he going to do with the guys that make the car seats?
The same thing.
And do the same thing. The guys that make the paint, same thing, same thing, same thing. Now, he very quickly finds out where, for example, in fact, I remember the paint one because it's an example we use in business classes. He realizes that, okay, the paint's actually made out of 3 parts. Parts of it's made out of, some sort of a base that you make paint out of. But one of the major parts is actually minerals. So he realizes very quickly that the paint guys tell him, well, it isn't that we can't make more paint. We just can't go more minerals because there's only 2 mines that dig up this stuff and they only dig up this amount of the stuff because there's only this much demand for it. And he says, well, I need 10 times more. And they basically tell him, well, the mines don't want to dig any faster. So given his attitude, what's he going to do with the mines? I think you guys can see where this is going. He buys them. He becomes a miner. He buys all the mines, and now he tells the guys to start digging the mines faster. About a year and a half into it, what happens is he starts to run short of steel because the guys that make the steel aren't used to making large amounts of steel. So now what he does, he gets in the business. He thinks, well, to hell with you guys. I'll buy up the steel plants. I'll start making my own steel. Then he gets told that there isn't enough iron ore being dug out of the ground to make more steel. So he goes and he buys the iron ore mines. This is what we call Fordist production. Somewhere along the line, which originally had probably been a necessity, he couldn't make enough cars unless he had control of all the parts. So, I mean, it sort of makes sense. You're going to expand, and if you had the money, why not buy the guys? They're going to keep on telling you no all the time. You might as well just buy the damn thing and just do it yourself, because at least then you tell yourself no. So he increases all the production. He's selling these things. But very quickly, as another mentality sort of shifted. If you actually control all the iron ore that makes steel, if you control all the things that make wheels, if you control all the things that make leather seats, if you control all the things that make paint, what do you have? Especially paint. If you're the only company that makes paint in the United States, what's that called technically?
Monopoly.
It's a monopoly. Why is a monopoly a really good thing? And that doesn't include playing that stupid board game that my family doesn't play because we all cheat. What's the great advantage if I already picked another one here. Oh, well, if we'll say that Madison has a monopoly on paint. If you buy any paint in the United States, her company makes all the paint. What does that mean she can do?
Raise the prices.
She can raise the prices wherever as high as she wants, because if you guys want paint, guess what? You got to go talk to Madison. There's no other way around it. She's got a monopoly. That's what a monopoly means. A monopoly means that you not only control the production, but you control the pricing of that production. And somewhere along the line, Ford went from necessity, which is if he wanted to sell cars, he had to control this stuff. When it started getting the iron ore and stuff like that, then it went from necessity to him suddenly thinking, damn, he wouldn't actually have any competition, because if he controls all the parts that make up a car, and he's the only guy in North America that has control of all the parts, he can make sure that no one else that wants to make a car can do that, because he's the only one making the parts. So if you want a motor, you buy it from Ford. If you want wheels, you buy it from Ford. If you want paint, you buy it from Ford. If you want seats, you buy it from Ford. This is what we call Fordist production, where you basically take originally what was just a car, and you'd go back to that whole, remember that whole thing of production of labor that I went over, I think, a couple of weeks ago. He basically decided that what you could do is you could monopolize the entire process of production from raw materials to a car and control all of that. And that's what we call Fordist production. Now you have to remember, he's doing this in the early 20th century. There's telephones just starting up, but it's local. There's no internet. Radio hasn't even started up really. So to a certain extent, if he's controlling all this stuff, he's literally controlling it by virtue of telegraph wires. So it's literally guys going like, dig on a thing, like remember the old Western movies. He's basically saying, okay, I need more of this and more of that. How is it going to make that very hard for him? We'll say he's in Detroit, which I think is where they were. How's it going to make it very hard for him to control the guys that are digging up iron ore in Alaska or Canada when they say, oh, we've got a problem? What can't he do that we're doing right now?
Call them.
He can't talk to them. They can't have a discussion. They can't have a conference. These people are basically, in fact, usually what they did is they wrote letters to each other. Now, if you've got some sort of a problem where all of a sudden your iron production is stopped and you need some advice on it, you need to have that start up right away. All of a sudden you got no cars because there's no steel. So what happened is on one hand, I would think it's probably ego, because Ford had a huge ego. So he just had this fantasy that he can control anything to do with cars, which would make him not only the wealthiest guy in the world, but probably the most powerful guy in the world. So it's a hugely attractive thing if you've got a massive ego to want to control everything in production. That's called Fordist. He wanted to control anything that did anything. He wanted anything that had the word car in it would be Ford. There'd be no other words there. Ford and car would be the same word. It'd be sort of like Xerox when you talk about copying stuff. If Xerox actually controlled everything from the paper and anything that had to do with copying stuff, that would be Xerox. IBM in the 1960s tried to control everything to do with computers. They wanted the logo IBM to be the same as the word computer. Apple in the 1990s wanted everything to do with smartphones when they first came out. They wanted Apple and smartphone to be the same word. So they're all trying to do the same thing as Ford did. They wanted monopolies. Now, in the case of Apple, that meant that you had to make all the chips that were going to be made for any sort of smartphone had to come from Apple factories. The plastic or glass that's used for the case had to come from an Apple glass factory. The plastic case in the back of it had to come from Apple plastics factories. They were also the only place making that type of plastic. And Apple almost went over. They came this close to going under for the same reason that Ford actually went bankrupt for about 3 months. And that's why Chevrolet, or now you call them General Motors, that's why Chevrolet became a successful car manufacturer, because they saw Ford going absolutely crazy, trying to control everything. And Chevrolet just decided, no, we ain't going to pull that shit. We're just going to make cars. And before Ford knew it, the whole thing fell apart around his ears. He couldn't control mines out west. He couldn't control iron mines in the north. He couldn't control steel factories. He didn't know anything about that stuff. All I knew how was to make a car. He didn't know how to mix paint. So if the guys he's put in charge of the paint mixing plant come up with bad ideas, and they did for a while, all the paint on Ford cars would just peel off. You just literally peel the paint right off the car because they were mixing it wrong. Why? Because the guys mixing it were folks that he'd hired to run his companies. They weren't people who knew anything about making paint. And so what happened is Ford almost went bankrupt. He came that close to going completely bankrupt, and Ford would have disappeared by 1921 as a car manufacturer, except for someone else, I can't remember who was, bailed his ass out. And so that's why they term it Fordist production. You'll hear the term in business a lot. When someone gets a massive ego attack and decides they want to control anything, they want to make a monopoly, not only of the thing, but everything related to the thing. That's called Fordist production. Now, when Jobs tried to do this with Apple in the 1990s, his attitude was with the internet and the way the world had changed and early versions of what Zoom is and stuff like that. He thought you could now micromanage everything from wherever Apple's headquarters are in Cupertino, I think. He thought you could actually sit down at a table and you could micromanage everything to do with ever making a computer or a cell phone from one place. And it blew up in their face. They just like Ford did, good, what, 100-something years earlier, they just know it was exactly the same thing. That was completely belly up. Any number of people in business always see this as their golden trophy they want to win. It's not enough to make a lot of something. What sooner or later they seem to get is this addiction where they really want to be the only player in town, the only game standing. So what happened is you had two versions. You had Ford, which is a monopoly on everything related to making a car. And what replaces is what's called post-Fordist, and that was places like Chevy, who all they did is they made cars. They didn't care who made the wheels. They didn't care who made a steering wheel or who made the seat. As long as they could figure out what the price was and guarantee enough of them, then fine, let the other company make this. Let the other company make paint. We're not interested in it. All we make is cars. And that's what Ford had to go back to. Because there was a period of time for about 8 years where Ford basically was in the United States. If you bought a car, it was a Ford. They were the only thing around pretty much. And they lost that completely. So the two ways of looking at production are either Fordist, where you want to control every aspect of something, or post-Fordist, which would be you only do what you do in a very specific area. Now, Fordist, post-Fordist has popped back up in the last 5 years. And I'll give you a hint. It starts with F. See if you guys think about it. You guys use it or you used it. And I'll give you a hint. It's a little bit different because in this situation, it's not an actual object. It's something you use on a daily basis. I'll give you a hint. It's hard to do without a chalkboard or a whiteboard. It's got 8 letters, and there's 2 O's in it, and it starts with F. And the guy was famous today because he just donated $300 million to helping people vote as of this morning. His last name starts with Z. Oh man, you guys would never do any well at any sort of game show. If they still have game shows, I think they do. You guys would all be don't take this wrong, but you guys would be total losers. 8 letters, there's 2 O's in it, and the O's are next to each other. And the first letter's an F. And the guy's name who owns the company owns a majority share and it starts with a Z. No one knows? Zuckerberg, Facebook.
Oh,
Kayla sort of had it.
I was gonna say it, but I was confused. I didn't know how to spell it.
Oh, yeah, Facebook. What Zuckerberg wants to do is control all communications and social media. That's his version of the Fordist approach. So Instagram, a lot of these other programs, he bought up 2 new ones a couple of months ago. He bought Oculus, which is the 3D vision system a couple of years ago for about $2 billion or $1.5 billion. He wants to control anything to do with social media now and in the future. He wants it all controlled by Facebook, i.e. him. If you want to, he's the 2020 version of Ford in 1919. Okay. Now, what would be the advantage if he can do it? I should point out that he's one of the guys that originally was really aggressive about throwing TikTok out of the United States. Why?
Foreign company.
Yeah, foreign company, he can't control them, he can't buy them, get their ass out of here. Okay. Facebook and its subsidiaries, and there's 9 different companies under Facebook. I can't remember what they all are. I don't think Snapchat's part of Facebook, or is it? I forget. Anyways, all those are part of the same package. They're all owned by the same small group of people, and Zuckerberg's the majority shareholder. Amazon's there's some arguments Amazon's trying to do somewhat similar with production, but I don't think that's really quite the case because they don't really produce in the same way. On the other hand, Facebook is actually a production company. They make software. If he had his way, what would you guys have to pay in 10 years from now? Let's say that only Facebook companies are social media. Everything else has disappeared. What does it give him the ability to do? We'll say that, let's pick out someone I haven't picked on yet. Sorry, I have to segue up in here. We'll say that Amy's come up with a new social media platform, which is really good. And it's much better than anything that Facebook has got. But because Zuckerberg and Facebook now control all social media, the only way that she can get on the internet would be to what? If he has a monopoly.
Partner up with him?
Yeah. And he's going to say, okay, you can keep 20% of the company, I get 80%. And she says, I don't like that. He says, fine, then you're out of business. So the thing about a monopoly is you not only control everything aspect of it, you also control the fact that you don't have any competition. Now, at that point, if he actually has the only social media platform that exists in, say, the United States, what does that mean he can start doing to you guys that he doesn't do now? Actually, this is probably relevant because we haven't covered it in this class yet, and I'm not sure we ever will. How does Zuckerberg make money if Facebook's free and Instagram's free?
Ads?
Nope. Nope. That's a little while. I should say that's about 5% of his revenue. What's the other 95%? You guys never see the other 95%. You don't ever see the other 95% directly, though. Kayla's a little bit right. You see it if you look at the ads you get on Facebook. What's sort of creepy about the ads on Facebook or Instagram or any of the platforms?
They're like,
do.
yeah, they're the same.
They're what?
Okay. It's kind of complicated because like I see it too, where like it'll like be the same. It'll correlate what Anila said. Like you'll see the same ad on Instagram and then you'll see the same thing on Facebook.
Yeah. And what can you tell me about the ad on Facebook or Instagram? Will it be a generic ad that I see if If Anella's got on her account and I'm on my account, will we see the same ads?
No.
No. No, all the ads will be typed in very specifically to us. This is why if you ever watch, if you look carefully, it's actually worth looking at these because it really can sort of creep you out. You can do a Google search on something one day, and 2 or 3 days later, all of a sudden, anything related to that will start popping up in the ads on the side, even though you just did it out of curiosity or maybe did it for this class or something like that. And that's because that's where they make the other 95% of their money. And the last time you actually saw this is when you first accepted Facebook. You clicked a little box down at the bottom, which says I accept. What did you accept? Not that anyone reads this.
They can like monitor your internet trafficking or your like search history or whatever.
Yeah, I know, because that's what my company does. We do web design. Or actually, we're the data guys. We're the ones that steal the stuff off your phones. Sorry. That's actually what geographers do a lot. If you think about it, there's no difference between collecting data that makes up a map and collecting data on you guys that we put on a map. Data is data. Okay. So we don't do this very much, but we're consulting. So that's one of the consulting services we offer. And that's what you guys did. Every time you click accept on any app or any other function like that, even if it's, for example, if it's in Google or one of the other ones and it's actually I can't remember what they're called, the add-ons, whatever the things are that you have up on the top. All those are basically, you're clicking that accept button, which allows them to track you in almost every way. Anytime your phone's on, you're being monitored by at least, depending if you got the regular pattern of social traffic, social media. You've got 6 or 8 different companies that are tracking everything you do from where you go to everything that you buy and every aspect of it. Now, how does Facebook make money off of that? I'll give you a hint. They don't actually do the ads themselves. But why will Target pay Facebook a bunch of money for your guys' information?
Isn't it kind of like directing them to the specific interest that would pique the customers? So
Yeah.
they more likely get sales from them or something.
Exactly. Because if you guys think about it, you're all in university. You guys don't buy the same crap you did in high school. The last thing you want is look like a high school junior. It'd be embarrassing. Your friends would think you got dropped in your head or something like that. And the same thing with high school juniors don't want to look like you guys because as far as they're concerned, you're walking dinosaurs. To them, you're these ancient, ready for retirement people that are at least 20 years of age. So as far as they're concerned, you're completely over the hill. The last thing they want to look like is you. On the same hand, the last thing you want to look like is them. So if I'm Target and I want to sell a boatload of stuff, Peyton's exactly right. I've got to have a very finely tuned system that I can basically use to advertise to, say, Chaminade and UH students, which might be a different group. In fact, I can guarantee you is a different group than, for example, community college students. And sure as shit is not the same as I'm going to sell to Sacred Hearts or St. Louis students. So I've got to, the more targeted I can get this stuff, the more data I can get on you, the more I can make sure that Target sounds like the place you should go to. And the more I then know also is what type of stuff should I buy to put in the store that I have a good idea that you guys will want to buy. Okay? And this is where the money is. That's where Facebook and Google make all their money. They make their money off of knowing what you're going to do. And the scary thing is if you use the AI at Google, which is the one we work with, it'll actually tell me what Kayla's going to buy next week, even though she doesn't know yet. And this is why if you look at Amazon, if you ever go to Whole Foods, if you have a Whole Foods account or say Foodlands account, their Maikai card, you'll notice that oftentimes they'll advertise stuff that you haven't purchased in a couple of weeks, but you buy it regularly. And they'll say, oh, by the way, this is going to be on sale next week. And you start thinking, oh, that's going to be handy. I could use some of that. It doesn't really dawn on most people's minds that they just told you to buy something that you haven't looked for maybe in the last week or so, because they know you persistently buy this on a statistical basis. The airlines, for example, we did a fair amount of work with Hawaiian Airlines. We still do a fair amount of work with JAL. They pay Google, I think Hawaiian Airlines is paying Google about $500,000 a month for information on folks, because among other things, Google will actually parse it out. People that fly in airlines, people that fly in airlines out of cities that Hawaiian Air flies to, where those people go to, what type of things they purchase, what type of things they go to and places that they visit. So for example, in Google, I can tell you everyone in the state of Hawaii and where they went to in Las Vegas, where they gambled, and how much money they lost, and what they bought while they were in Vegas, and what they ate while they were in Vegas. Everything you guys do with a card is owned by everyone that you have your social media on. And every time you walk around your phone, in fact, I have this function on Google since I work with Google. In Google Earth and Google Maps, there's an actually function. I don't know if you guys can get, you might be able to get it. Maybe it's only in advanced. But you actually have it on your phone. Every third of the month, I get a report from Google that tells me every place I've been last month and how much time I spent there. Down to every 5 minutes. Gives a complete map of every place I've been in the last month. And if I wanted to pay extra money, it would tell me everything that I purchased. And among everything, you have to remember that all these services basically do this to the extent that they actually know when you're on the internet. So that, for example, this search page that showed up is actually recorded by all these companies. It's not just when you're using their service. You basically are paying them, and that's how you pay them. Sorry, we've gone over here. Got off on a tangent there. But it's relevant because that's actually the newest form of production would be digital production, I think, in many ways.